So this is an experiment. This is the first attempt at doing some kind of a mini pod for penguin parenting. And I'm joined by Beccy.
Hello.
We are going to have a little chat about how Beccy first knew or suspected that her child might have autism in particular, or just general neurodivergence. So we're looking for that. Like, was there an aha moment? Was it like a slow trickle? Can you remember? Take us through it.
In some ways, it was a slow trickle with a few kind of key moments like thrown in there. So I guess the first thing actually goes down to you, actually, when our sons were at preschool together, right? And I remember you were like, hey, I've just found out about this Elaine Aron highly sensitive person thing. So I got the book, like I read about it, and I did there's like a little questionnaire, isn't there, in the start of the book. So originally I was just thinking about me and I was like, I tick pretty much every single one of those. And then I thought about it for my son, and yeah, ditto. But then I remember using that term in Facebook Messenger group, and one of the other women in it got like really angry at me, and she was like, this highly sensitive person thing is just people who are autistic who don't want to have the label and stuff. So
I was
like, oh, sorry, I didn't know, like whatever. I found the concepts helpful anyway, so I just kept like working with it. And then a few years later, I don't know, I guess I found my son quite like comparatively easy as a baby, but I just felt like then toddler was hard, preschool was harder. And I think people were like, I don't know, I was just thinking, because I only have one kid as well, and I was just thinking, well, like at some point I feel like this is supposed to get easier, but it feels like it's getting harder and not easier. And so I was in the Facebook group, and I described something that my son did, which was often, so when he was like I guess like an old toddler or preschooler, he would hurt himself, like he'd fall off the sofa or something. And obviously I'd hear him cry, so I'd kind of come running in to see if he was okay and, you know, try and comfort him. And he'd be like furious at me. He'd be like, why didn't you come sooner? Why didn't you stop it? And I'm like, well, I came, like, I'm sorry you're hurting, dude, but like I came straight away, you know, sort of thing. And it would be the same thing, like if he was building something in Lego and it broke and I was nowhere near it, he'd like kind of blame me. And I'm like, this is just weird, I don't understand it. So I posted in this group about it, and one of the other mums was like, oh, my daughter used to do this all the time and she's PDA. And I'm like, what's PDA? And then obviously she sends me the link. So yeah, that was like me going down a research rabbit hole and going, oh, I really think this describes him, I really think this describes him.
So just to pause you for a sec, so PDA stands for pathological demand avoidance, and is a profile within autism. It doesn't tend to be something which is diagnosed in and itself, but it's something that during the autism assessment, depending on who does it, they can kind of screen for that sort of branch of autism, if you like. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I read up a load about PDA and I thought, well, yeah, I feel like this might fit him, like, because I'd always, and again, this just goes to show how little I knew about it as well. Like basically my knowledge of autism at this point was taken from Dustin Hoffman and Rain Man, you know. So it's like, not, you know, great film, but maybe, you know, like as the saying goes, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. So I had this false idea at the time that, oh, like autistic people don't have empathy and stuff. And like my son, it was very clear he was always very empathetic. That's why the highly sensitive person thing like meant such a lot. So I was always like, no, he can't be autistic. And then this PDA thing was like the first thing that made me go, oh, like, no, I think this could be, you know, because it presents differently to like how people often think, I guess, about like regular autism. So I thought this was it. And regular autism, yeah, like as if there was a thing.
Whatever that is, yeah.
If you're just listening to this on audio, I'm doing like the speech marky things with my hands at this point.
She's doing that.
But I sent it to my husband and he read it and he's like, yeah, I think he is wired a bit differently, but he's like, I don't think he's got this. So I kind of shoved it out of my mind for another few years. And then we had COVID, obviously, which was a time of like nothing was normal for anyone. But it was when we were coming out of COVID and getting back to more of what I guess other people would consider to be normal. Like I remember, and this was the moment when I think my husband like was like, there's something else going on here as well. So it was like a Sunday night. We were all quite tired. There wasn't much food in the house. So I was like, let's go to Pizza Margherita and get a pizza, which is, by the way, was one of my son's favorite pizza places. And he had like a total meltdown at the idea of going out and getting a pizza. It just seemed really out of proportion to like, you know, especially considered that he loved pizza.
Yeah, it was supposed to be a good thing that would be
exactly
him. And somehow it was something he just couldn't handle. So what kind of
exactly.
behavior, like, do you mean he was like shouting and screaming, he was crying?
Yeah, all of that.
Just didn't
All
want
of
to go.
that.
Right.
Refusing to go, like just completely distraught about it. I think that just left us all a little bit shell shocked. I mean, he'd always had big reactions to stuff, but this was like the first one that was like, even to my husband, he was like, yeah, this doesn't seem very normal. So that was when I was like, yeah, I'm going to look at this PDA thing again.
So
And
what
yeah,
did you actually do in that situation where you had this idea for dinner? It was obviously a last minute thing. Do you think that's
yeah.
probably why he wasn't coping?
So like what he actually described to us, he didn't use this language, but basically he was saying that it was like the sensory environment was like too much. So I think what we actually ended up doing was, yeah, obviously we said, okay, we're not going to go then. And I think we might even have booked a table, actually. I think that might have been what it was. We'd rung up, booked a table, and then he like was, yeah, completely like just refused to go and stuff.
So you
And it was
didn't
just,
go.
we didn't go. I sent Peter for like, he went and got like, rung them up and said, look, can we have takeaway instead? And they very kindly put it in cardboard boxes and he drove down and got it. So we had pizza, but we had it at home.
That's probably a win-win. First of all,
Yeah.
I mean, obviously it was, several years ago now, but the fact that you didn't then force him to go through with that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a whole other topic, but this is where I think as parents, we're always struggling to do the right thing, aren't we? And to balance the push-pull of like, sometimes we all need to do things we don't want to do versus what
Yeah.
child can cope with. But I think that's where I've got this whole big thing about the number of times people use the word resilience or resilient when it comes to neurodivergent children and adults.
Mm-hmm.
They just need to be resilient. No,
Mm-hmm.
you need to give them agency. And actually, he took his own agency, didn't he, in that
He
instance?
did.
It wasn't something
He
he could
did.
cope with. He would, I'm sure, if the cards were stacked differently, he would have loved to go.
Yeah.
But in that he couldn't, you guys recognized that and then amended things accordingly. So you still got the dinner. The
Yeah.
restaurant still got their income, maybe not the
Yeah.
tip, they got their income,
Yeah.
and he got to recover, presumably, and eat his food. So well done.
Yeah.
So that was
Yeah, it
like a
was.
turning point for both you and your husband then, do you think?
It was. I think like
Yeah.
the next day I was like asking around friends like who'd, done, because I knew that there, and we were, again, this is obviously an option that's not available to a lot of people, which is a very sad thing, but like I knew that the NHS waiting list was like 2 years or something for autism, and I was just like, I just want this done, so I'm going to go
Yeah.
private. So yeah, next day I was like asking people for recommendations, and then I think I was filling out the form later that week, still with like, I mean, you talk about like, when did you know? It's like, well, obviously I didn't, right up
Yeah.
until you get the thing, you're like,
Obviously.
am
Well,
I just making this up?
I think, yeah, the thing is, when we talk about knowing, it's like a difference between when as parents we feel convinced enough that there's some kind of neurotype there that perhaps isn't the norm versus some other professionals agreeing with us or not. So it's never really knowing, is it? Because it isn't a blood test. So,
No.
I mean, we've received the diagnosis and you've received the diagnosis. It'd be interesting to talk to people who didn't receive the diagnosis because it doesn't change what your child's behavior is and what your child's struggles are just because
No.
some slightly detached professionals do or don't agree.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, you went through the private route and you got his diagnosis. So can we talk about how did you make that decision and how did that process go?
Yeah, I think I asked several people that I knew whose kids were like, I asked for recommendations basically. And I think the first one, the one that was closest to us, was actually not taking on new like assessments because they were so oversubscribed, which,
Oh,
says something,
goodness.
doesn't it? So we went for somewhere slightly further afield. Another reason I went with them was because they specialized in PDA, which I thought it was at the time. Although interestingly, that's not what we came out with. They said, no, not PDA, regular autism. So regular autism, I'm doing my speech marky fingers again. But yeah, I quite like the process because, well, it was quite a detailed form that you had to fill in, like lots of questions about different things. And I liked it because I think there were some like, yes, no, like rate on a scale of 1 to 10 type questions, but there was also quite a lot of free text questions, like what would happen if this, if you tried to do this, or like explain, what happens for your child when this happens or that, so it was
Okay.
gave like a lot of space for me to sort of describe, I guess, like our lived experience, which I thought was good. So it took a long time to fill in, but they'd also said, which again I found quite reassuring, because obviously they're not cheap, these assessments, but they said, look, after we get your form, if we think there's nothing going on, we'd tell you at that point. If they think there is, we'll invite you straight in for an assessment. But if we're not sure, then we'd invite you to a Zoom call to talk about it further. So that felt reassuring to me, because it was like, okay, you're not just going to take my money, you know. I think I didn't hear anything back, which they said would be the case, for like a month or something. But then when they got in touch with us, it was like, right, do you want to come next week? You know, it was really quick.
So it wasn't the intermediary Zoom call. It was the, yep, we'll talk to you.
No, it was the yeah, straight through. So I was like, okay. Then the actual process was that they, and we also put in a little bit extra for like an ADHD screen as well, because there's often overlap. And they did give us the option of like, your child could have the observation bit. They could do that like on Zoom if they wanted. But I was like, you know, my son's not great on Zoom, so I think it would just be easier for him and for everyone if we did it like in person.
Okay.
So we just, yeah, they sent through a nice thing, which was good, like for the kids actually, of like, this is who's going to be with you on the day. This is like what our place looks like. This is what to expect, which is nice, obviously, because a lot of neurodiverse kids appreciate that. And yeah, it ended up being like quite a nice day out, which sounds like a weird way of like, but yeah, we had quite a long drive to get there. It was like a nice day in the spring. I remember they did like a bit of chat with all three of us to kind of put us at ease. And then, because he was only, what, he would have been, I'm trying to think what age he was. I want to say like 7 or 8 or something at this point in time. But they basically, it was like a really nice space, and they didn't take him away from us to do like that. Me and Peter we just sat and chilled in chairs in the corner, like, which is a bit odd, because you're like and also, but I don't know what they're looking for. So it's like, you know, because they're just basically playing with him and like asking him questions, like reading a book with him, like doing this puzzle with me. So we were like there in the background all the time. And they also did, which again, something not all places will do, but they did, I can't remember what they called it, whether it's like a cognitive assessment or something. So it's basically to see like if there were also any challenges with like, say, visual processing or verbal, or like, you know, any of this going on. So yeah, and they gave us a break halfway through to like go for a little walk around like the village, which was nice. And then we drove back home, and then we had to fill in more questionnaires. I think that was actually for the ADHD part, and his teacher also.
Yeah.
The final part of the process was like a 2-hour like Zoom interview with the person like leading the assessment, which is basically, I think that was like the developmental history bit. So like asking you about with me and Peter. Yeah. So not with him. He was like, he wasn't present for that, but asking you like as a parent, you know, when your child was this age, what went on, and like, you know, the stuff.
That's very similar. I mean, it was delivered differently, but that's very similar to what we had. Right. And then how long did it take from that process being finished till you actually got a report? Like, do you remember?
I think they said like within a couple of weeks, but actually it took longer, and they were really apologetic, and it was because someone else who will remain nameless hadn't filled out their forms. But yeah, when we got the report, it was really, it was kind of helpful and interesting. And you know, I guess another thing that I did check out like before going down the route was like, you know, I checked that they use the nice guidelines, because I didn't want the risk of like, you know, paying for this and then having the NHS like not accept it, which, you know, which can be a thing. So yeah, we checked that was all kind of compatible. But yeah, we got a really detailed report back. It's probably about like 20 pages or something. I don't know. Yeah.
So when you received the report, like, did it come in the post or on email? Do you remember?
It was on email with like a password protected thing.
Yeah. And were you like, ooh, like, were you kind of nervous, or like, how did you feel when that dropped into your inbox? Were you like, okay, here we go?
I think we received it like right before I was actually about to go away on like a work trip. And so I read the first page that confirmed that he had the diagnosis, and I like skimmed the rest, and I was like, oh wow, there's like loads here. And I just thought, right, I'm going to read that on the train. But I just like seeing, like knowing that was like, oh, okay, I know the outcome, you know? So that was, I think a relief. It's obviously like, it's a big thing in some ways, but yeah, it definitely felt like a bit of a moment for sure.
Yeah, a bit of a moment. I like that. Yeah, absolutely. And then did you tell your kid right away? Like, do you remember how he reacted?
I can't remember if I told him right away, like, because I think, yeah, because I was away for work. I think I told him, like, you know, when we had some time when I
Mm,
got back. I guess what was nice was that ever since actually finding out about that, like, Elaine Aron highly sensitive person thing, like, I'd been talking to him about, like, this is a thing. And, like, this is, you know, if you ever get confused by, like, you know, why this feels like a lot for you, or, like, you know, I was just basically because I recognized, I guess, that I grew up with a lot of like kind of feeling different and not knowing
yeah.
why and feeling like a bit crap because of it. Like I didn't want him to have that. So I was like,
Mm,
you know, there's loads of positives to this. Like this is, you've got super strengths in these areas, but these are the areas that are going to feel more challenging, you know, and that's not because there's anything wrong. That's like, so I'd always tried to frame that you are going to feel a bit different, but like in a strength-based way. So I guess it was only like, and that conversation just evolved. So obviously, you know, all the time that we were
right.
going through the assessment process, I was like, look, there's this thing called autism. And like, you know, so it was just an update of that conversation. And so we knew
Brilliant.
that's why we were going to do the tests and stuff. So then it was just like, okay, yeah, I've got that. Like it was not, and he's kind of
Which is
proud of
like
it. Like he
the
goes
next
around,
fact. Yeah.
yeah, it's like fun
That's
fact about me.
super. Yeah,
So
exactly. And it's just, it sounds to me like, and very similar here, that we've just sort of, it's always been, ever since I've known about highly sensitive person as a concept, it's just become part of the kind of like language of our household, because I
yeah,
recognize very quickly that I'm a highly sensitive person, whatever that means, which is obviously why I shared it with you. I don't tend to use
yeah,
the highly sensitive person phrase anymore, because now neurodivergent has become such a
yeah,
kind of catch-all for myself and my son, even though we have different neurotypes.
yeah,
So
yeah,
interesting.
absolutely.
But yeah,
Yeah,
we've always tried to, because he's not Rain Man and because he's not seen Rain Man, we've just always kind of gone through this rhetoric of this is just another neurotype, because I don't, there are so many positives about it, which I guess is
yeah,
a whole other conversation about the positives far outweigh the negatives. And yet to be pathologized, you need to
yeah,
highlight the negatives. It's such a weird process. I wonder in a few years' time if this is going to be so different, how they actually, you know, how the NICE guidelines, you know,
yeah,
actually assess different neurotypes, because it's still very much kind of disease based, disorder based,
yeah.
you know, pathology
I hope it
based.
will. I hope it will. And actually, you reminded me. So, another really nice thing about, like I say, I really liked the people that we did our assessment with. And yeah, the woman who sort of like led on it right at the start of the developmental history Zoom with like me and my husband, she said, okay, like, I'm going to ask you like a lot of questions about stuff. And she said, like, I have to apologize. She said, this is, it, she said, it is framed in like deficit
Yeah,
language, but she
it
said, like,
is.
we know we don't like that. And she's like, it's something that I want to change. So she said, we deliberately to counteract that. Like they started off actually, she asked, like, what's he good at? What do you really love about him? And they put that in the
Yeah,
report as well. So that
yeah,
was really nice to see like clinicians in
same.
their own way trying to overcome. Yeah.
Yeah, because obviously they're given the tool. That's the tool they have to use.
Yeah.
But yeah, it would be nice to see an evolution in the way, and it is happening. It's more an evolution than a revolution, I think. But in the
Yeah.
way people consider autism, particularly those that have autism, who are
Yeah.
finding their voices and, you know, being more open about stimming in public and just generally being the neurotype that they are,
Yeah.
and how it really is this kind of like the neurotypical world's problem.
Yeah.
um and I think it's interesting you said about COVID. You know, we've all been through this global pandemic and it was horrendous, obviously, but the way the world has now changed in terms of how people can work and study and all these other things that actually lend themselves to people with different neurotypes, who don't
Yeah.
necessarily want to leave the house every day, who, you
Absolutely.
know, get peopled out much more quickly, etc.
You know what, you're also reminding me of like, I missed a crucial bit of the story. So the other bit between, well, God, how did I miss this out? This was so crucial. So I think during that whole time when I was like suspecting but not, I think I went through a time when I was like, okay, now I'm 90% sure that he is autistic, but I don't think I want to get a diagnosis because I didn't want him to have a label. I did, you know, at that point in time, I was
Sure,
like, I don't want the stigma. And I was like, you know, it's not gonna, like, we still know him and love him and we're still gonna like help him be, you know,
of course.
help him take care of himself and like all of that. So I was like, it's how it's dealt with. I was like, a label doesn't change anything. But then a few people like challenged me on that, which was really good. I mean, I think you were one of them actually, which was great. And then I also it's just one of those lovely like serendipitous like life experiences. So one of my friend's husbands, actually, who I didn't really know at all, like I don't think I'd even met him at this point, she had shared with me that as an adult he was learning that he was autistic, actually, and that had been a hell of a thing to process, like in his 30s. And she was like, do you want me to put you in touch with him? And I was like, well, if he's happy to talk about it, that would be amazing. And we had this beautiful conversation like on WhatsApp, which I am forever grateful with, like where I was like, hi, you don't know me, but like I'm thinking this might be going on for my son. And like, and we just had this amazing conversation about my son's experiences, about his experiences, like, and he said that my son reminded him a lot of how he was at this age. And he was the one that actually eventually said, he was like, you know, it's totally your call, but he said, like, I'll just tell you that it's been a hell of a lot to process, like as an adult. I think I would rather have known like from younger and like had that affirmed. And I was like, yeah, that's such a good point. And I think that was what made me go, that, and the fact that I was aware that in terms of school and some settings that they sometimes people are like reluctant to make adjustments for you unless you do have a piece of paper. So I was like, okay, we'll get the piece of paper then. But yeah, I was so grateful to him for sharing his lived experience, because like I always find those kind of, you know, medical questionnaires and like, is it this, is it that, and you're like, well, I don't know, like it's not a yes no answer, like how much is very and how much is, you know. So actually hearing someone's account of their life, I think hearing first person accounts of what it's like for me has been like much more helpful.
Well, this is why I wanted to do this series as well, because I think when you have a child who you begin to suspect perhaps has a different neurotype, is autistic or ADHD or any of those sorts of things, it is a process to find out. Even if you go straight away into, oh, I want an assessment, unless you're paying for it, as you said, it takes 2+ years. So there's that period of time where, as a parent in particular, you're kind of going, well, is he, isn't he, is she, isn't she? How do you know? How, you know, what makes me think this? And so I thought a series of parents who could just share, well, this was my story and these were my kind of aha moments, might sort of really resonate with some other parents. So we've got a number of people I'm going to be chatting to who've all got different types of kids, different ages. Obviously everyone's journey is different, as you said, but when you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. But the one thing I think that is a common thread is that all of the parents I know see it as a positive, or see far more positives than negatives. And hopefully we are starting to see a sea change in the way neurodivergence generally is looked at as just the other neurotypes. That's not to say that people whose autism does cause them profound disability shouldn't then also get help. But for those whose autism is manageable, and that they can adapt their life to work for their neurotype rather than trying to pretend to be neurotypical, which is just exhausting and leads to burnout, that would just become the norm, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd be really interested to know, did the school in particular change the way they talk to you as a result of the diagnosis? Like, what's that journey been like with Senko and your child's school?
When I said to school, look, we're going for this like diagnosis, they were like, they just couldn't believe it. They were like, we don't see it in him at all. In fact, even one of his teachers was like, look, I used to work with autistic kids, like I don't see any sign of it. And I'm like, well, you don't see what happens at home, buddy. You know. So yeah, because he's always, I guess, you know, it's what, like masking, right? Like he fits in at school, like, you know, where he has to. And actually he's been really lucky in that he has had really, on the whole, like really supportive teachers, and you know, he gets on super well with his friends, and like, yeah, he's quirky, he's different, but like it's not been too much of a thing for him. But as he got older and he's able to talk more about his experience, he's like, I find it so hard to like sit still and stuff and concentrate and pay attention. So and I chatted to his teacher about it, and she was like, well, we could like, she talks about some of the things that they do put in place for ADHD kids, and you know, she offered him like, I think kind of like resistance bands that he could put around his chair, and he was like, oh, I don't want to look different to anyone else. So he's very much like, but what they did do for him, which he has enjoyed and taken up, I think they were like, oh, we can give him a blob of blue tack, which is like, you know, blue tack is a really good fidget toy. So
it is indeed.
Blue tack did make him very happy. And you know, we've learned better what supports him, and therefore that puts him like in a better place in school. But there were times when he was having like quite a lot of anxiety and stuff, and I was talking to school about that, and the blue tack thing was one of the things that kind of came out of that. So yeah, I would say that they've been pretty good. They've totally tried their best. It's not easy for them though. I always feel like it's a system, they're trying to put flexibility into a system that is
Yeah.
really not like that, designed to be flexible. So
Yeah.
I think we've been kind of quote unquote lucky in that he is just about, on the whole, you know, with good holidays and good breaks and stuff, like, and good friends and enjoying his playtime, like it is just about, sounds
He's
really negative, it's
okay.
just about
Yeah.
bearable for him. I wish
Yeah.
it was better, but like, so he's not, it's not like they've had to put, or, you know, like really big adjustments or anything in place.
Okay. So prior to you deciding to go for the diagnosis, you didn't have much to do with Senko at all at the school or
Nothing,
anything,
no,
right? So it would be
no.
interesting to see, because for us, we got the Senko involved at the beginning, uh,
Mm-hmm.
and he said something along the lines of, you know, whether he is or isn't autistic, you know, he's still presenting with these issues and anxieties. So we'll treat that, you know, or we'll
Right.
work with that. We'll make adjustments around that, whether or not he gets a diagnosis, which I think is a really good approach. But yeah, I think that's another key question for parents as well, especially when
Yeah.
their child is like in reception year one in the UK. When do I contact the school with my concerns? That
Yeah.
is a definitely a whole other video, because there's a whole thing about how you have those conversations with the school, how you avoid them, the whole, oh, they're fine when they're here type of
Mm.
conversation, and what you can do to battle against that. So anyway, thank you so much for sharing that story about your little family, and I'm so glad that he's doing well. And
Very welcome.
yeah, and I imagine this would have been of interest to people if they happen to stumble across this video.